This is Ziewonja, a plant an English speaker might know as mullen or verbascum, an entire genus of flowering plants represented in Poland by about 9 primary species. The plant Ziewonja is among the most hardy flowers of Poland, favoring the dry, rocky soils which other flowers loathe. The flower lives between 2 to several years, and the seeds survive in storage for over a century. But most obviously, the rugged Ziewonja towers over its cousin flowers, including rosemary, mudworts, figworts, wishbones, juniper leaf, wild petunias, devil's claw. I think you're seeing the trend. Among many ground-dwelling flowers and a few vertically growing cousins like butterfly bushes and Cape petunias, none resemble the robustly stemmed verbascum. Despite seeking its home in rocky, dry soil, an adult Ziewonja can tower almost 3 meters or 9 feet tall. Even a more average individual spans almost 2 meters or more than 5 feet high. Ziewonja was known in the Polish region since before the Slavs existed. The people of the plain knew Ziewonja as a crucial herb to the treatment of inflammation and the sicknesses that stem from it, including asthma, chronic coughing, migraines, types of IBS and digestive disorders, and of course, burns, frostbite, bruises, and bug bites. Most use of the plant within Poland involves extracting the sap-like milk from its flowers and leaves, and mixing the milk into honey to make a thick drink. But along with its medical uses, the towering Ziewonja became especially important to the Polish people with the onset of winter. According to folk wisdom, the growth of a tall, healthy individual suggested the oncoming of a winter of deep snow and extreme cold, which the plant was preparing to endure, while an abundance of short stalks would mean that the oncoming winter would be short and merciful. The plant was not preparing for a deep, dark winter. The towering stalk of Ziewonja is covered in fine hairs, a bit like a dandelion stem, and these hairs caused the plants to be stripped and stuffed into boots and clothing. Because of the general shape of the plant, but especially because of the soft hair and its warmth, the plant gained a nickname, Mary's braided hair. This towering stalk also served excellently as a torch, and when the stalk was burned for light and heat, its flame would often dance in a rainbow of colors thanks to the chemical mixture in that sap-like milk. Byproducts like the stems and leaves would be broken down into kindling, while smaller plants or the smaller stems would also be harvested, dried, and equipped as excellent candle wicks. And from this use in candles came the secondary name for the plant in Poland, knatnika, from candle wick. And much like essentially every other use of fire in Polish folklore, the candles and torches made from Ziewonja would serve important roles in cleansing the home and all the farmland in winter and spring. The many holidays of winter and spring often favored the use of Ziewonja-based candles in the sacred work of chasing out the demons of winter, which we've discussed before. The quintessential example of such holidays came in February, when the Lady of Candlemas is venerated, usually considered to be one of the many forms of Mary, though we should be cautious not to equate the many forms of Mary, given their many distinct functions in the various holidays. Our Holy Lady of Candlemas wandered the farms in February, lifting her candlestick with its wick of Ziewonja, and the fire ushered by the lady would preserve the life of the fields so they could awaken again in the coming spring. She would take her candle to houses and bless the children, plucking hairs from their head and burning them to bless the kids and prevent sickness in the coming year. The fire drove away the winter demons, and therefore protected the home from lightning strikes, since God wouldn't need to use his might to drive the demons away, since her candle had driven them out. So her candle is called the Thunder Candle, and she is also named Our Holy Lady of the Thunder Candle. Her presence drew the wolves away from the home and livestock, and in her presence they became calm and loyal, like domesticated dogs. Her presence brought order and stability to counteract the chaos which the demons had wrought through the season. She would also use the candle to light Christmas candles in the homes of those she met, and the burning of their own would tell their futures over the coming year, whether the candle burned for a very long time, like a healthy stalk of Ziewonja, or whether it burned out quickly would foretell their oncoming fortunes and misfortunes. Soon after, she departed back into the dark nights of February. The people kept her fires burning, and over the coming months the warm breezes of spring began to return, like the warmth from the thunder candle. This woman is understood by historians as a remnant of polytheistic faith. Her name is Ziewonja, the goddess of ancient Poland who was first evoked by name within the histories of Jan Długosz. since the state of the Lekites happened to arise in an area containing vast forests and groves, which the ancients believed that Diana inhabited and claimed domain over, and Ceres was considered the mother and goddess of harvests, the abundance of which the country needed. Therefore these two goddesses, Diana, called Ziewonja, and Ceres, called Marzanna, enjoyed a special cult and devotion. She was also attested by Oskar Kolber, a prolific folklorist and historian of the Sorbs, the endangered Slavic minority of eastern Germany, who wrote, Džiwica, goddess of forests and hunting, present with the southern Sorbs. This beautiful maiden carries a bow and arrows with hounds. They also speak of someone who stayed in the forest at noon. Beware, so that Džiwica does not come to you. They say that she hunts even during moonlight. This is Slavic Polytheism 101, and today we discuss the wild goddess of the Western Slavs, the keeper of the light through winter and the bringer of summer, Ziewonja. We've begun this video with her most recognizable holidays, so we'll next explore her further appearances in holidays throughout the year. We'll then discuss her etymology and the historical circumstances which likely contributed to her position in worship. We'll also follow her legacy through folk tales of Polish double faith, and we'll end with her legacy in Polish culture and art which endures today. After two complicated discussions of overlapping domains and obscured folklore, the defiantly obvious and direct appearance of Ziewonja through Polish culture can be startling, but nothing less could be expected from any goddess with such a character as hers. Truly, as Marzanna was winter, formless and phantomly, the deity of illusions and metamorphosis, her opposite to Ziewonja is quite a consistent face, a fire that burns clearly and brightly throughout her entire domain. Finally, let's get to know Ziewonja. While we move forward into spring, we find the Ziewonja mostly appearing alongside other characters who derived from divinities. 1 month after the Days of Thunder Candle, Ziewonja reappears alongside an effigy of death named Marzanna, who was set on fire and then cast down river. In many villages, the casting away of death was accompanied with, or was soon followed by, Gaik or Maik. In most villages, this custom was done by young girls, but in some it was all children. Today, the effigy of springtime is most often a spruce branch, or a fir branch, or pine, basically any evergreen or needle-leafed tree. They were decorated with ribbons of red and yellow and gold, and sometimes ornaments with symbols dedicated to Mary. In Polish towns like Łódź, the effigy of Gaik was once a young woman herself, represented in Poland by a doll, often as the centerpiece of the effigy decorated with many Marys. But further in the past, she was sometimes a young girl. It seems that the custom of dressing a young girl as the Queen of Spring for Gaik in Poland had probably faded due to a perceived redundancy with another holiday following in May, featuring a totally separate character of the King and the Queen of Spring, partaken in Poland as part of Palm Sunday and still celebrated in the Czech Republic and Croatia today. While the Queen of Gaik is associated with spruce, the King and Queen of May are tied to willow trees and are probably the same characters who appear as the bride and the groom of the maypole, and then continually reappear through the rest of spring and early summer. For this discussion, we'll assume that these Maytime monarchs are not the queen who casts away Marzanna. While the King and Queen of Spring saturate holidays like Dingos and the Green Week, we still glimpse the Ziewonja we know within smaller appearances which support the larger holidays. Much of Good Thursday and Friday dedicate themselves to women and girls making palm leaves. Then everyone partakes in the egg-based customs which rejuvenate the spring with nature's fertility. Young women would bathe in the rivers under the midnight moon of Good Sunday to be blessed by the spring and ensure her luck as a bride and her fertility. And if these women ran into any men on their way home, then those two would be fated to marry. And so the many fertility customs around lovers go on and on, but will be discussed in the video about the springtime monarchs themselves. For this time, Ziewonja's journey through the year continues in the background. At many churches, the people lit a massive bonfire or a large fire in the church, which was often named the Undying Fire, and was seen as the continuity of the fires which survived the winter. And the people took candles and sticks to the church, and took their shares of this eternal fire back to their homes. There, the fire would again be purified, and the demons would be kept out of the house by smoke of the branches and candles, and from incense which was lit by this sacred fire. Then the immortal fire was transplanted into the oven of the home, and so the fire of the household was renewed with the springtime. From there, the remaining candles and branches were taken through the fields to once again bless the crops and scare away mischievous demons of agriculture, to ensure that these crops would grow abundantly through the spring and summer. And now winter was fully gone, and the fires kept by Ziewonja finally rejuvenated the world. Just after Pentecost, similar customs were repeated with the lighting of great bonfires between the fields, which were used to ignite branches, which were again carried between the crops to bless them and protect them from the pests. After the fire's blessing, the matron of the household would cook a hearty meal over the bonfire, and the workers would eat around it among the crops. And just around Corpus Christi, the people once again went to bless the fields. Now, at shrines dedicated to the Holy Mary, the people gathered wheat and spices and herbs and used them to make blessed wreaths. As bonfires were lit, the farmers took these wreaths through the crops and often buried them or burned them like offerings to bless the harvests. Specifically, these wreaths would ensure the mighty summer storms and the lightning would be merciful to the crops as they ravaged through in pursuit of stray demons, while the other wreaths were taken by wives to the homes to use in the treatment of sore throats and sickness in the lungs. Others were placed under the foundations of new homes, or hung in the main rooms of the house to bless it. These customs finally lead to Midsummer's Eve. The famous and massive bonfires of midsummer are wholly unlike the fires before. Traditionally, the midsummer fires are made anew, using flint and stones as the ancients would, and this new fire was named the Living Fire. This fire was reborn. It was no longer the fire kept alive by candles. It was not the elderly fire brought from the previous year. Instead, this fire was the return of the progenitor fire. The fire-bringer above had returned on the longest day of the year with fire from the sun itself in hand. For the rest of the summer, the holidays of fire directly relate to Svalrog, the primordial god of fire, and to Perun, the fire-bringer and the god of lightning, which was seen as fire made from the sky. Ziewonja's dutiful guarding of the fire of the previous year finally ends, and she passes the baton of the fire to the fire-bringers from the sky. From the summer solstice, Ziewonja won't be clearly and definitively seen again until the onset of the winter solstice. Through all her holiday appearances, we strongly see Ziewonja's role as the keeper of order, strength, and life, and everything embodied by the sacred fire trusted to her by Perun and Svalrog. We'll now dive into her folklore to better understand why Ziewonja was called the wild matriarch of the Polish wilderness. In modern Western culture, there are certain deities who have become so synonymous with their ancient domains in artwork and culture that it's difficult to convey their universality. An easy example might be Neptune or Poseidon, whose mighty forms and imposing tridents are still totally synonymous with their ocean domains, and so his image in association with the ocean is absolutely inescapable in Western culture. Likewise, the character of the forest princess or forest queen was similarly universal, especially in 18th and 19th century Poland. Her presence in folklore and fairy tales makes it impossible to select or retell just one story about her, but her most common appearances were as a young girl or a young teen. She is innately recognized as the ruler of the forest, just as Neptune is known as king of the sea. This character could also appear as the similar wild aunt, a sort of feral woman who lived in the forest and ran with the animals, appearing and watching from the distance, and encouraging people to behave and obey their respect to the wilderness. If adults transgressed near or trespassed into her domain, she would chase them around and force them out of the forest. But she could also be kind and helpful to children, especially those who were lost. Another similar character was Grandma Blackberries, who behaved similarly in the folklore of Kazubia as the queen of the forest and the guardian of lost children. While the forest princess would almost never meet adults and only sometimes met and helped or played with children, she mostly interacted with her wild animal subjects, especially deer and foxes and rabbits, which isn't surprising. Many of these stories were told and were popular during the partitions under Germany, Russia, and Hungary, a time when Polish culture was suppressed, and most Polish folktales which were published or told in the open were altered. They self-censored themselves by removing most or all human characters, and instead they told older Polish stories using mostly animal characters. But if it wasn't the princess speaking to her animals, she spoke to her magical companions, who were collectively called the forest children or forest babies or forestlings, a type of shape-shifting spirit or creature, who always appeared younger than their monarch. They appeared as toddlers when the queen was a young girl, or as tweens when she was an adult. These forestlings played tricks on children and especially punished misbehaviors, but they'd also fool adults who mistreated the forest or who mistreated their children. They would lead especially cruel adults into the forest to make them disappear. These forestlings also saturated the demonized end of folklore. The babies grew up to be Boginka, literally translating to goddesses, or the Dziewozona, roughly young wild women. These spirits generally appeared in one of three forms. Firstly, as an incredibly beautiful young woman who was either naked or wearing an incomplete bridal outfit, or simple white and revealing clothes. Secondly, as a haggish and horrific woman, with claw-like fingers and long, blanket-like breasts with disfigurations across her body. And thirdly, as a sort of in-between, a beautiful and well-endowed woman with a few hidden haggish features, such as sharp teeth, or an animal tail, or hidden animal legs, often those of birds or deer, or wolves, or with a telltale disfiguration, such as exposed bones. This trend also shared with Ukrainian field spirits, and is also somewhat similar to Lady Midday, who we discussed in our Marzanna video. The beautiful variety are best known for emerging from nature and seducing lustful men, then dragging the men away to consume him, and later art is especially fond of depicting the man they targeted as an explicit piece of shit who had his fate coming. The halfway goddesses become more reminiscent of the water spirits like the Lesawka, in that they often lured and abducted all types of people, be they men or women or children, and the haggish goddesses were said to specifically abduct newborn children, specifically enacting their schemes either at midnight or at highest noon, replacing the human child they abducted with false children or lookalikes, and they carried the human back to their nest in the wilderness, where they raised the child to be one of their own, while the human mother raised the lookalike. Or sometimes they really abducted the mothers, either while the mother was in labor or as they were resting just after birth. The abducted mother was taken to the nest and made to breastfeed the lookalike children and generally care for them, while the haggish mother went about her duties, herding the wild animals in the forest. But the human mother was usually returned home before long. The goddesses were defensive of their own children, and if their own child was threatened or harmed, then they'd sense it and return to their nests, or they'd return from the forest to return the human child in exchange to save their own. In stories from the proximity of Kielce and in the forests west of Wisagura, the folktales said that there were specifically only 3 goddesses who were all each other's sister, while Russians often said that there were 27 to 30 sisters, corresponding roughly with the days in a lunar month. The goddesses were protectors of the forest who tended to keep humans out of their domain to protect their animals, which they also hunted with bows and arrows, a relationship a bit like farmers who raise and then butcher their livestock, but the bows of the goddesses were most readily used on humans who intruded into their domain. Especially in the east, they were said to favor hunting by moonlight, since the moon was their god, and the subject of their worship and devotion. Their nests could be described as spun or woven, like a basket or like clothing. Some lived in the water, but most of their kind lived in caves, or high up in the trees in the deepest forests. Especially in southern Poland and the Tatra Mountains, they lived in the deep caves under the mountains, where they had villages where lived dozens of their type, with subterranean trees and nests, while to other villages only a single queen goddess lived at the bottom of the deepest cave. Folklorists tend to agree that these descriptions all belong to a single spirit, and hypothesize that their many forms emerged as Christianity regionally simplified them, as creatures embodying the wilderness. Much like the spirits we discussed with the Voros, these goddesses likely began as shapeshifters who went between these forms depending on the situation, taking the form of beautiful women to comfort children, and sometimes to kidnap them, either to save them from a cruel parent or to steal them away for themselves. Or, of course, they could appear beautiful to seduce and then kill a lustful or cruel and selfish man. They then might take their ambiguous forms as a more neutral stance, which could shift into either extreme as soon as it was needed. They could become hags with claws and teeth when they needed to kill or wanted to strike fear into a person who they wanted to punish. All of the bogowie are givers of fortune, but also those who take fortune away, so naturally the protectors of children are also capable of harming them. The guardians of the forest also hunt the wildlife in their domain. These behaviors depend on their circumstance, and that context simply deteriorated in folklore as Christianization progressed. So the positive attributes became the forest children and the forest princess, while their negative attributes became the goddess hags. The missing stage of our picture might be the spirit named Lesawka, literally the forest women. These forest spirits begin their life as mortal humans, but as tweens or young girls, they become hopelessly lost in the forest. And even though their bodies continue to grow into adulthood as they wander the woods, their souls have become claimed by the forest, and these women are essentially the growing dead, their bodies disfiguring as they age through life. Their fingers become claw-like, and their skin turns corpse-pale. Often they grow an additional breast or two, or an abnormal number of legs or arms or fingers, like a knobby and twisted tree. Since they are now dark and dead spirits, they can no longer bear their own children, but they feel an instinct to become a mother, so they kidnap children from the living. And depending on the story, any human child who drinks the milk of the forest woman will either die and become their ghost child, or they will literally be changed into a spirit themselves. We should note that the symbolism around the appearance of this spirit isn't unique to itself. In several folktales, we learn that several species of tree originated as human women before they were transformed. Granted, most of these stories involve a specific curse, so they aren't fully relevant in the discussion of spirits, but it's important to highlight the thematic motif. Concerning the abduction of mothers, folklorists speculate this to be an explanation for postpartum depression, explaining the mother's shift in mood and their detachment from their nurturing instinct as the trauma they suffer from being abducted and made to breastfeed the baby demons before being returned. Interestingly, the existence of lookalikes and the swapping of children could also be a metaphor or folk understanding of child abuse or childhood trauma. The Boginka notice an abusive parent, and they then steal the child and change them into a lookalike, or replace them with a false child and carry the true child away to protect them in the forest. The child which returns to the abusive parent is changed. They act strangely, they're erratic or distant, and this is consistent with the symptoms of PTSD or a trauma-induced disorder like personality disorders, or like dissociative disorders, such as multiple personality disorder. The subtext here is, despite being kidnappers, the Boginka remain the guardians and protectors of their stolen children, who themselves may or may not be changed into fellow spirits. And if their future will consist of rescuing children, then as far as outcomes go, the fates of the children really aren't that bad compared to other folktales. We can understand these various spirits as sacred beings within the domain of the forest queen Ziewonja, just as the treasurer and the mountain spirits inhabit the domain of Vovos. While they only appear as either the innocent forest babies within fairy tales, or as the horrific demonized spirits in folklore, this separation into either the sacred or the demonic, without a middle ground, is very common in Christianization. Originally, these seemingly opposite figures were explicitly connected to one another. This painting, depicting a wicked demon goddess emerging from the beautiful and sacred Ziewonja plant, is very intentional. The many vegetative women of the wilderness naturally become associated with the queen who rules their domain. These spirits might appear as horrific, but their existence are the faults of human error. Parents mistreating their children, either through neglect or abuse, or children who forsake the rules of the forest and bring on the scorn of the wilderness. None of these demonic women are supposed to exist. Rather, they come into being because a human made a critical mistake, and these fearful beings are the consequence. The error of humanity is changed by the wilderness, making the human into a wild form. This is an element of the balance between order and disorder, where the human chaos is made into an orderly but unusual type of nature to maintain that balance. In these wild women, Ziewonja enforces her own tight-fisted rulership and order, but her kind of order and maintenance of stability is itself transformational. This gives her rulership a more subversive or resourceful character, the rule of order through wit and scrappiness, appropriate for the goddess who guides the fire of summer through the depths of winter by her own resourcefulness rather than sheer might. While the connection between Ziewonja and children can be seen through the spirits of her domain, the nature and function of her own personal connection hasn't been fully understood, and to understand it, we should discuss Ziewonja's maidenhood. While the words maiden or virgin are typically used to describe Ziewonja's character in English, we should examine the Polish words themselves. Often the words Dziewa and Dziewica are equated by translations as the same word, but especially when discussing earlier history, we should recognize their nuances. Dziewa serves as the root of both Džiwica and Ziewonja, and it refers to a girl who is typically within an age range of about 8 or 10 to about 15 or 20. Adulthood began either with marriage or with the entering of a career for the unwed. To the ancient Slavs, any adult or sexual acts were taboo, outside of the married within their home, outside of very specific religious settings, though probably not the type that you're thinking of, or outside of semi-official acts which young people could partake in who were seriously courting one another on specific holidays and magical days. But this wouldn't be allowed until the young lovers were already essentially a year or two away from getting married. So the word dziewa gave way to the word dziewica, which is usually translated as virgin, but in the context of ancient culture would generally mean a young woman who is not married and is not seriously being courted. The English word virgin has a lot of weight around sexual activity explicitly, but the archaic form of dziewica wouldn't be specifically tied to sexual experience. A woman without children who matured into another livelihood would no longer be a dziewica. So even though she would be an adult virgin, she would not be adult and a dziewica. So the label is best understood in this time as an age range, rather than a description of sexual experience specifically. In order to properly and fully understand the implications of these words falling within Ziewonja's domain, we need to discuss the significance of certain cultural norms and societal structures within the ancient Slavic world. Throughout human history, at least 10% of adults typically suffer from infertility, though this rose in times of famine and disease. Different societies established different norms around these people. In Europe's Christian core, these people mostly became monks or nuns. In much of Athenian-aligned Greece, where women were considered property, infertile women often became low-status secondary wives who served as a maid and as a midwife. This partly reflected in Artemis as a virgin goddess who helped her own brother be delivered, though we should note that Artemis did choose her maidenhood, which gave her a degree of agency that many Athenian women lacked. Otherwise, women in Athenian-aligned culture might join a temple to serve a deity and work for the city. This is somewhat seen in Athena's position as a virgin goddess who dedicates her life to art and warfare. We can also see the stigmas placed on women to bear children within the myths of Zeus and Hera, but we'll stop because that would take more than an hour that we don't have to explain. Meanwhile, other cultures and other places more easily accounted for the childless adults who would inevitably arise in their societies. For example, many southwestern North Americans lived in extended family systems based around their family matriarch, and people who couldn't have their own kids would step in as professional aunts and uncles to help care for their siblings' children. This was so widespread that these families became semi-communal. Every adult in the home was essentially obligated to serve the duties of a parent, whether they made that child with their own body or not. If the Greeks and the Southwest Americans represent two ends of a spectrum, then the majority of historians place ancient Western Slavs near the middle. Most Slavic women who never married did have a few options. They would become magic women who devoted their lives to worship, or warrior hunters who fought in wars and then hunted in peacetime, or some became craftspeople who focused on trading and traveling around to sell their wares. These societies still favored marriage, so ensured that the majority of people married, but thanks to the status of women in many Western tribes as close to equal or even equal with men, these women still found higher statuses in their societies and were free from the harsher taboos and ostracism which were given to the unmarried women of other cultures. With all of this in mind, Ziewonja slots very easily into the system as the matron goddess of those women who became warrior hunters because they could not bear children. This source within the societal system is mirrored by our neighbors and cousins, the Baltic Zvoruna or Medina, which translates as the Huntress. Likewise, Mayaliki of Finnic-Ugric religion, we and these neighbors all share this perspective of the warrior and huntress woman who symbolically serves as the mother of their forests since they bore no children. And we all share this perspective because our societies were home to women like this who prayed to the matron of their livelihood. We find this form in the folklore of the Circassians and the Saetians, the most direct descendants of the ancient Scythians who helped form all of our cultures. Their folk songs and orally maintained epic poetry recount the many beautiful women who lived as housewives according to the predominant cultural norms. There was also the rare woman who was as strong and ferocious as their counterpart men. These so-called manly women rode the steppe on horseback, hunted flocks of deer. She, the warrior maiden, was sought after by many men, but she rarely married because her livelihood was hunting on the steppe. We likely all share this form in our religion due to the ancient inhabitants of Eastern Europe. Among the many Scythian tribes were those who featured such warrior women. These societies with these powerful women seemed to inspire Greek mythology about the Amazonians, which is why the Greeks claimed that the Scythians, especially these tribes, were the descendants of the mythological Amazonians. Within Greek cultures, women were typically the property of men, so the prospect of women chieftesses of the steppe and huntresses who sparred toe-to-toe and were equals with the best male warriors was simply the stuff of mythology, another worldly concept to them. But in the Pontic, the warrior women were very real, while to much of Greece they had to be fiction. All of this is to say that in the distant past of Eastern Europe, among the Scythian tribes and the oldest West Slavs before their exposure to Christianity, along with cousin cultures in the Baltics and the far north and far south, there existed a normalized and respected social class of warrior hunters who could be men or women. And this likely at least partly developed to account for the natural percentage of society who inevitably would not be able to have children. Since Christianity strongly wants people to either marry or become priests and nuns, this gradually faded, but it left strong impressions on our heroic warrior maidens of our folklore, such as Wanda of Krakow, the warrior and virgin queen, honored in death with the appropriate ancient warrior's grave, inherited from the Scythians. Of course, the Slavic tribes were incredibly varied, so while some gave almost equal or equal rights between men and women, such as those which allowed polygamy for both men and women equally, other tribes strongly favored men, and these tribes generally eventually saw their worldviews propagate as Christianity favored them. But the combining of tribal identities into the nations was messy and complicated, which is why, even if men became favored in the domains of politics or leadership, there were also many cultural spaces where we still remember our ancient equality. In parts of Poland and Lithuania come expressions like, the husband is the head of the house, and the wife is the head of the husband. The husband is the head of the house, and the wife is his neck. She decides where he looks and what he says. The feared and stern but beloved grandmother remains a prevalent cultural icon for a reason. Some viewers might feel like this is common sense, like of course men and women would find ways to act more or less equal, even if leadership tells them that they aren't. In the home, nobody dares question the mother. But this really isn't the case in a lot of Western countries, especially historically. Women's suffrage might have been a founding principle in our countries, but it was a brutal and painful fight in the West, especially in America. We won't delve fully into politics here, but suffice it to say, yes, patriarchy of a type exists in all of Eastern Europe, but the Western kind is just an entirely different beast. Leave a comment if you want a video exploring this idea. I feel that a lot of miscommunication happens between the West and East over this disconnect. All of this is just to say that when a Westerner calls Artemis a virgin, especially with modern vocabulary, it has a very different connotation than when the Ziewonja is associated with Džiwica, especially in older dialects concerning the historical faith. But to find a deeper understanding of Ziewonja, we should return to folklore to find where else she resides. Of all the landmarks of Poland, perhaps none have captured the hearts and minds of storytellers as deeply and strongly as the mighty Wysoka Góra, the mountain standing over the northern Wisła, the summit of all the highlands. It was here, sometime around the year 1000, where a Hungarian prince named Emeryk had supposedly witnessed a miracle. Saint Emeryk had been invited to Poland by King Bolesław the Brave, who was trying to Christianize his domain and needed trained priests from allied nations. The saint came to Poznan and oversaw the training of holy men, and between his work he'd travel the countryside with the nobility, often going on hunting trips, and soon he had fallen in love with the Polish countryside. One day, Emeryk traveled to the villages near Łysa Góra. This had all been the site of the temple to the old goddess Woda and the gods Lelia and Poleli, probably her sons. This temple of the pagan gods had been destroyed likely in the time of Mieszko, the previous monarch and the first Christian ruler of Poland, but the people of the forests and deep ravines of the Łysa Góra countryside were slower to convert than the people of the lowlands, and they were in need of a skillful missionary. But young Emeryk was preoccupied by the beauties of the mountain, and soon after he arrived, he arranged with the village elder to spend his day out in the forest on a hunting trip. Emeryk soon found himself deep in the wilderness, distracted by the tracks of an elder stag. And sure enough, he found his way into a clearing, and he locked eyes with the most beautiful stag which he'd ever seen. A mature and powerful buck with shimmering antlers of gold. Emeryk realized that the stag's leg had been snared in twisted branches of a fallen tree. The forest monarch was imprisoned. Breathless from the monarch's beauty, Emeryk notched an arrow and took aim. But before he could let it fly, the golden antlers suddenly let out the light of the sun, so blinding that Emeryk dropped to his knees and covered his face. Soon as the light had appeared, it vanished, and the holy man looked up. The stag vanished entirely, without a trace, and Emeryk witnessed a stranger standing in the tree's branches above him. The stranger was an angel, shimmering as golden sunlight, and the angel spoke. They instructed Emeryk to retrieve the shards of the Holy Cross of Christ which he owned, and to bring them to this spot, to establish his monastery here, and to make this mountain his new home. So the young Emeryk obeyed his angel. And this site is where the monks built the monastery of Łysa Góra. But the story of Emeryk was not the only encounter of this type to happen in early Christianization. Polish viewers might or might not know the story of Emeryk, but they likely recognize his tale as very similar to the folktale of Saint John of Mata, another holy man beloved by Polish folklore. We say that John had met a white deer of shimmering light, with antlers which themselves grew into the form of a red and blue cross of Christ. Any Western viewers might find similarities between our Emeryk and John and their own Saint Hubert of modern-day Belgium, who once also encountered a sacred white deer with silver antlers, which carried a glowing wreath endowed with the cross of Christ. Or from England, where the story also is given to Saint Eustace. Yes, this apparently happened 4 times to 4 saints. While explaining the history of these stories from outside Poland is beyond the scope of this video, we readily find parallels which tie the tale of Emeryk to the wider folklore of Poland and to the folklore of all Western Slavs and all of the Carpathian cultures, with connections throughout Eastern Europe. Through the winter time, an image exists in Poland whose folkloric roots have become obscured, but its general motif remains. Deep in the snow, there's a young and strong stag. Sometimes his antlers are golden or silver or glowing with light, and he is running through the countryside and keeping a fast pace. Laying or sitting up in his antlers are his little sister, a young human girl, and she is sometimes holding a torch or a candle, and she looks around and conveys information to her brother. They're fleeing hunting dogs and tear through the winter for survival. Their main appearance remains in folk song passages about the siblings passing through a half-frozen river, the stag swimming and fighting to keep his head and his sister held high. It seems that once a much longer folktale about these two existed in song, this song became a core or component of many different songs, and its full structure was gradually lost. But we can find more details about this pair of characters in neighboring Romania and Hungary. Given their presence in Poland and Czechia, it's likely that these tales were once widespread and interconnected, but slowly diminished over time. And this story from our southern neighbors with our shared characters goes as follows. In the forest, and of course a long time ago, a young boy and a young girl, brother and sister, were walking in search of berries and mushrooms. As the afternoon drug on into the evening, they came across footprints filled with water, and they're thirsty, but they refuse to drink the water since they were warned by their mother not to. And then they passed the footprints of birds, and they refused their thirst. But as they passed the footprints of deer, the poor brother was so thirsty that he couldn't wait. So he knelt and he drank the water, and in a moment he turned into a deer. They were both startled, but the sister hung his basket on his antler and they carried on, since the sun was getting low, and as nighttime set in, and wolves and dogs barked and howled in the distance, the stag brother lifted his sister up into his antlers, and then hoisted her into a tall tree, and he stood guard over her, and protected her as she slept. As the sun returned, she awoke and climbed back into his antlers, and they carried on their way. And that's where the story seems to end, as far as I can tell. Every appearance of the stag and his human sister on his back or in his antlers seems to all evoke a common pair. Given the glittering and fiery aspects of the antlers of the stag, especially compared to the very similar character who might be the same, it seems important to reiterate Ziewonja's role as the goddess who carries the fire sent from the sun through the freezing winter. The glittering sunlight and fiery angel manifesting from the golden stag, and the sister living in the shimmering antlers of another stag seem too similar to not point out. And this folkloric connection between a stag and the protection of children saturates folktales about deer from the Carpathian region and its surrounding regions. For instance, one Czech story follows this form. In a cottage deep in the forested mountains, a very young boy lived alone, but received daily visits from a golden-antlered stag, who brought him food and cared for him. The stag insisted that the boy stayed at home, and did not venture out into the forest, since the forest was filled with the young forestling girls who loved to play tricks, and would want to abduct him. So the stag instructed the boy to never open the door unless the knocker was the stag himself. But the next day, the boy heard a knock at the door, and opened it to greet two young girls, who sang and cheered and laughed, and they convinced him to step outside of the home. Then they snatched him up, and he screamed, and the stag, who was grazing the grasses nearby, heard his scream, and the stag rushed over and scared the young forestlings away. The stag warned the boy sternly, but the next day the girls returned to fool him into opening the door again, and they snatched him and whisked him away to the mountains where they planned to cook and eat him, and he screamed, but the stag was too far away to hear him, was grazing in the valleys several mountains away. But as the day got low, the stag discovered that the boy was missing, and he then tore through the forest at tremendous speed, and when he heard the boy's screams, he appeared and whisked the boy out of the cooking pot and away from the forestlings. The stag scolded the young boy for his foolishness, and the boy finally learned his lesson not to listen to the lies of strangers. Meanwhile, most Polish tales evoking the stag were briefer, but followed similar motifs. In the forest, a lost child encounters demons, or a mischievous child tries to get out of work, but is approached by a predatory forestling or another demon, and the stag appears to scare the demon away and save the child. The stag is always the savior of children, whether his antlers are golden or silver. Sometimes these stags can be found within more significant folklore, such as a primary folk tale about the founding of the village Złotów in northwestern Poland. In this village in the distant past, the people lived in paradise with their forest of abundant herbs and wild game, with blueberries and cranberries and all manners of flowers to treat sicknesses. In that abundant forest around them lived an amazing stag, taller than any other and with antlers so incredibly large as to resemble trees. He would stand in the roads of the forest and observe the children, and sometimes approach the young ones to say,
"I am the king. Don't fear me. I protect these forests, and I protect you, so long as you respect me and my realm."
The noble king of the forest was loved by the children and the village, so when their lands were invaded and occupied by plunderers, the people went to the clearing of the forest king to ask for his help and guidance, and the king summoned all the animals with his mighty roar, and together they and the people orchestrated a war against the occupying forces. The king led the people to destroy the castle made by the villains, and the people found endless gold and amber within, and became wealthy and named the town down after this blessing of gold. Then the people placed the image of their savior and the god of their forest into their coat of arms, where he remains to this day. Similar tales can be found across Poland. The noble deer who either shines like gold himself or who brings his people gold is a somewhat common folk hero. The whiter white or golden or silver deer also saturates the folklore of the southern neighbors of the Caucasus, the Ossetians and Circassians, who also trace back to the ancient Scythians of the Bronze Age. These characters saturate their folk religion as one of the most important symbols. The deer represent divine rulership. They embody specific goddesses and gods, and motifs point to an individual deer-like spirit. The tawny steed on which he rode has the head of a deer, and its head reached into the heavens, and from its fetlocks sprouted long tusks. When it dashes out, it gallops. When it gallops, you cannot see it. The deer is a celestial animal. The mounted stag's antlers reach into the sky, often symbolic with both sun, moon, and the stars. The antlers of the stag are an echo of the structure of the sky itself, in a story quite similar to the Slavic journey of the heroic prince into the afterlife to save a princess. The Circassians tell this story about their demigod or Nart, Shoslan's journey to the afterlife, containing this passage. The sun had only just risen, and its first rays had penetrated the reeds. In their light, Shoslan saw the golden doe. It was coming slowly towards him, nibbling around at the grass. The sun's rays, reflecting from her golden pelt, seemed finer than the sharpest small needles. Creeping up quietly, grass blade by grass blade, he approached the golden doe. Now he was within bowshot. He placed an arrow in his bow and was about to shoot, but it suddenly dropped and disappeared. Shoslan seized his quiver, but not another single arrow was left in it. The golden doe saw him and flew off to the Black Mountains and hid herself in a deep cavern. Shoslan was quite unaware that he was pursuing the daughter of the sun, Esiorukos, though disguised as a deer, who had 7 giants to protect her. As we've discussed, the South Pontic cultures are the most direct descendants of the ancient Scythians, who also constituted a significant portion of the ancient cultures who eventually combined to become the Slavs. And in both of our folkloric canons we find the legacy of the golden deer of Scythia, the animal who represented the world above and the vast heavens over the steppe, symbolizing both the sun and the moon, but more directly the domain which they share. The antlers of the celestial deer are analogous with the branches of the world tree, both structures spread out to represent the world above us, the domain of the sky gods. Whether branch or antler, both are the pillars which constitute the sky. So the deer who roam the ground and the world between are the connections which tether us to the world above, an echo of the sun and moon and sky which travels our world. This function becomes the candle-bearing Ziewonja, her candle representing the fire of the sun as she keeps our connection to the sky realm alive, even through the harsh winter. She hunts at noon and midnight. Her followers act in brightest day and darkest night, because these are the peaks of the strength of the sun and of the moon, and so are the peaks of Ziewonja's connection to them. She rides her golden-antlered brother, who himself embodies the sky's presence on earth, representing her bridging of the celestial and the terrestrial. While they're far more distant cousins than the Pontic people, the Hungarian nation also descend from the Eurasian steppe, and their ancient ancestors were very closely related to the Scythians who helped give rise to the Slavs, and it would be a terrible disservice to not briefly illuminate their preservation of very similar characters in their own mythology and folklore. Much like the Scythian stag, the Hungarian figure named the Miraculous Hind takes a pivotal, powerful place in Hungarian religion as the symbol of the sky. She's a female deer with majestic antlers which hold the morning star, the sun, the moon, or the stars, or the celestial figures might be shown across the different parts of her body. The celestial mother comes to earth to guide humanity through significant moments, the most famous instance being a primary variant of the Hungarian origin myth. As it goes, the brothers Hunor, the father of the Huns, and Maegor, the father of the Magyars, were in the forest hunting when they got lost and wandered around until they met the forest mother, the magnificent white doe with antlers of stars that shone like candles, and the forest mother led them through plains and meadows, across the steppe and the mountains, and eventually brought them to their new homeland. The forest mother soon vanished, but the son stumbled upon a community of young women who were celebrating a festival in honor of their goddess, and the two sons fell in love with two of these priestesses, and they eventually gave rise to the Hungarian people. Similar cosmic deer can be found in the folk religions of several peoples indigenous to the Ural Mountains and Siberia, but this feels like a good place to stop and summarize. For whatever reason, the concept of a golden or silver deer whose antlers represent the sky or the celestial bodies, or the connection between sky and earth, are present and often significant across a large percentage of what we could call the north-central Eurasian cultures. We might reasonably speculate, and many historians and religious scholars have speculated, that this cosmic deer descends from the days of the very first people who traversed the steppe. At the time that these people were roaming the world, the last glacial maximum had only recently ended, and the reindeer who have now retreated to the northernmost regions of Europe were still living far further south, and of course both male and female reindeer bear antlers. Likewise, many biologists believe that the ancient Irish elk who gave way to the modern deer population of Europe once also had both male and female antlers. And several anthropologists believe that the reason so many cultures across Europe, including the Irish, of course the Pontic people, the Ural people, the Slavs, the Hungarians, and so many, hold a reverence to a goddess associated with a deer whose antlers connect them to the sky. And this would make the shared nature of the cult of the celestial deer one of the more ancient components of these religions. Of a similar antiquity as the cosmic tree, which also unites many of these religions, or of the dualistic creation story where a bright god and a dark god compete in the creation of the world, which again is also shared by many of these religions. With her company among very similar figures found throughout Eastern Europe and to a larger extent much of Eurasia established, we should return our attention to Ziewonja specifically and to Poland. So we return our attention to Łysa Góra, the site of the ancient temple to the grand and powerful goddess Wada, and the site of a particular and well-known folktale about the Ziewonja. On one hand, this mountain was the stage of a mythological battle, which we discussed in our detailed video about early Polish history, where the legendary Polish king Leszko fought off an invasion attributed to Alexander the Great, Alexander meeting his defeat at Łysa Góra. And when this legend appeared for the second time in the mid-1500s, the Polish leader who fought off Alexander on the slopes of Łysa Góra was no longer King Leszko, but an unnamed and mysterious proud lady. In the previous century, the historian Jan Długosz remarked on the building of an ancient castle on the top of Łysa Góra, and he remarked that this temple was destroyed and eventually replaced by the monastery commissioned by Emeryk. Długosz claimed that the builders of this castle were one of the giants of the ancient times, but that their specific identity had been lost to him by the obscurity of time. So Długosz's message to us can be read in one of two ways. The first, in many folktales from the mountains of Poland, we see the presence of the giants, the gods of the mountains who turned to stone or disappeared in the first centuries of the world, who are often said to be the ancestors of humanity. Meanwhile, in other folk songs, giants are evoked as clear stand-ins for the gods of polytheism, the giants who built the sun, or stole the moon, or hung the stars in the sky. So, whether the giants who built the castle were the mountain giants who gave way to humanity, or whether they were the Bogowie, is left ambiguous, with Długosz admitting that he doesn't know which group to credit. Regardless, he indicates one of these two groups was said to build this castle, and it was eventually destroyed, and then the Temple of Wada and their sons was built and destroyed, and then the monastery of Saint Emeryk. So, in the subsequent chronicle, we find a more detailed telling of the building and destruction of Łysa Góra's castle. The folklore claims that it had been built by that proud lady who led her people to war which repelled Alexander. After her victory, from atop this great castle she built in celebration, the lady declared herself to be none other than the goddess Diana, the Roman equivalent to the Greek Artemis. And seeing this treachery, God frowned upon the lady and struck down her castle with mighty lightning. And the castle was destroyed, and the lady disappeared. But the story was fairly popular, and so the towns around the mountain developed their own endings explaining where she went. Such as a retelling where God sent an eagle after the fleeing lady, so she turned into a bird, and then a fox or wolf, and then a deer or rabbit, and eventually vanished into the wilderness around the mountain. Again, the proud lady's folklore could be interpreted in one of two ways. Historically, many scholars have taken this story as metaphor, seeing the so-called Diana as the Slavic goddess who fell to Ziewonja, who either because she displeased the chieftain god of the sky Patron, or as a symbolism of her fall under Christianity's god, was knocked down and her castle destroyed. But if we read the story more literally, we could also interpret the proud lady as a mortal human, or more likely as one of the mountain giants, as Długosz suggested. In this understanding, one of the mountain giants, the ancestors of people who were great but were not gods, declared themselves to be the goddess Ziewonja, and her claim to false divinity angered either the true goddess or the elder Perun, and one or the other struck down the fake goddess and her castle. It's unsurprising to see that the myth of Ziewonja's castle and the myth of the golden stag which appeared to Emeryk just so happened to occur on the same mountain. Given all the folkloric similarities to older myths, it wouldn't be surprising if the Emeryk story was simply an adapted or converted or Christianized rendering of the older story where Ziewonja and the stag appeared to give her authority over this sacred spot of hers. The only folk tales relating to this goddess more well known than Lisa Gura might be those of two sisters, the fiery burning Mary and the watery Mary, who are the daughters of the Mother Earth. This gets complicated since Watery Mary is also a nickname for Mother Earth herself, but in the context of these stories where she has a sister who is the Fiery Mary, this Watery Mary is symbolic of winter and death and sorcery, while the Fiery sister is the beautiful personification of summer. In these tales, the sisters slightly compete and bicker, but ultimately learn about outgrowing jealousy and accepting they need to help one another, and therefore these two characters are fairly popular for teaching these moral tales. But they're noteworthy as the most direct implication up to this time that the goddesses of summer and winter might be sisters. But any discussion of Ziewonja feels incomplete if we don't address the most unique impact she's left on Polish history. While many Slavic bogowie were rendered into the devil or demons or saints or versions of Mary, as far as I've found, the single only time that a Slavic deity became routinely known by the name of a Roman goddess was hers. Of course, chroniclers and priests often described the bogowie as the Slavic versions of Roman gods. Recall the description of Marzanna as the Slavic series, but only Ziewonja sees the resurgence of her folklore under the name of Diana, outside of the church and across dozens of artistic and folkloric works. The Mountain of Diana was only the tip of her iceberg. After the Napoleonic Wars, when the young country of Poland was crushed after the retreat of France, many Polish intellectuals fled to France as Russia regained control over Poland and increased its policies of Russification. In this time, many Polish artists brought trends from France back to Poland, and one of these trends was replacing the tactic of telling folklore with animals by using an internationally acceptable name for deities. The use of Roman gods as symbolic and metaphorical devices was well established in the West, from France to the young United States, where figures like Lady Liberty and Justice embodied ideals, and Roman gods stood atop government buildings but were not used for worship, serving only as metaphor. But in Poland, the old stories which had been told with animals and saints also began appearing in publication under the names of Roman gods. The saints were certainly still believed in, so when we see saints and Roman gods become equated, we can understand an underlying motivation. The The Russians would censor any stories which featured Polish folk heroes, but by disguising Polish heroes as Roman characters, they would often shield them from the worst of Russian censorship. And from this era, we find many strange new variations on older stories, seemingly non-existent Roman myths because they are Polish stories with Roman names. But while most of these stories are set in the past to represent historical Polish heroes or religious fables from the saints, only the figure of the Huntress Dziewanna expands past this framework. The Poles didn't internalize the Roman gods as tools of their own expression. While French writers were happy to utilize and transform the Roman gods for whatever symbolism they desired, the use of Roman gods served a much more strict role in Polish writing, likely out of respect for Polish figures. Think of it as similar to a prohibition, when Americans would buy cleaning products which came with warnings that conveniently suggested how to turn the cleaning products into wine and beer. The Romans are the cleaning product, and the Polish characters are the alcohol. But in contrast to this typical formula, which was used for most of the gods, Dziewanna shows up everywhere, in new poems, in new plays, in all forms of storytelling. During the second half of Poland's occupation, the figure of Dziewanna was inescapable, and this makes sense when we connect her to Ziewonja. Remember how the Forest Queen and the Golden Stag served as the guardians of the local wilderness. So too had the Poles under occupation prayed for the savior of the land to return and set them free. If you asked these Poles to explain their metaphors, they'd likely say that Dziewanna was the Holy Mary, who was literally reported as manifesting in person in the countryside to encourage Poles to endure this time. Yes, there were real routine Mary sightings. The Holy Mother of Poland was prophesied to eventually return and set the people of the land free from occupation. And of course this image of Mary was readily mixed with Wanda of Kraków, who gave her life for the freedom of Poland. And along with folktales about Wanda, people were also mixing in folktales of the old guardians of the homeland to make the ultimate savior of Poland. Some might call this process an extreme reckless syncretism. So along with Mary and Wanda, we see two new artistic figures in this era, the Roman Dziewanna and the embodiment of the Polish nation as a goddess. Again, national embodiments were somewhat common to the West, but in Poland, her religious use is moderately more literal. She's being used in hopes of stirring the Holy Mother of God to save Poland. And much like the sightings of Mary reported in real life, the poems and songs of Poland reported the appearances of the wild Dziewanna and discussed her innate and powerful rulership of Poland, her rightful and latent, unquestionable role as the true monarch. And the meaning is direct. This land is owned by Dziewanna, not the Russian Tsar, and the fate of this land will be determined by Dziewanna, who is also Mary. All the attributes we discussed about the Forest Queen are now attached to Dziewanna, and therefore Dziewanna is suddenly everywhere. And this Polish Dziewanna is changed from her Roman appearance. While the Roman goddess is sometimes connected to fire through ceremonial rites, the symbolism of fire is as consistent in the Polish version of Dziewanna as her place in the wilderness. The equivocation of these domains is constant, the fiery goddess of wilderness. Likewise, she is often paired with the sunrise and the breaking of dawn, with her ascension aligning with the rising of the sun, which is in direct contradiction to the Roman connection between Dziewanna and the moon, and serves specifically to solidify the Polish Dziewanna's association with the rise of the fire of the sun and the rising of the nation, which she'll cause. Meanwhile, the image of Polania, the goddess of Poland, usually appeared as an angel or nondescript figure made of light, or in the form of two angel-like sisters. If the sisters were given detail, then one was youthful and the other was elderly, meant to represent the old Poland who was being killed by occupation, and the furious new Poland who would emerge and violently retake her sovereignty. This motif also very directly draws from the death of Marzanna and the resurgence of Ziewonja, who then brings back the summer. This idea saturates Polish art, including the prolific play Lelia. Within his play, the ancient Celts, who are representative of the Poles, are being invaded by the ancient Slavs, who represent the Russian Empire, with the egging on of a Germanic princess, who represents the obvious, along with a lot of other symbolism. The two daughters of the Celtic king, the fair and beautiful Lelia and the powerful sorceress Rosa, witness the invasions and the destruction of their nation and subjugation of their people. The sorceress foresaw the destruction and knew it would come, but as their father's armies are destroyed, she reassures her sister that they are sacrifices like the Holy Mary. that she will be impregnated by the ashes of the bodies of the burned soldiers, and their nation will be reborn through her. She says, "Whoever believes in me while dying will die peacefully. I will take revenge, better than fire or war, better than 100,000 of the enemy, better than God." At the end of the play, all the Celts die, and Mary appears as an apparition. On the surface level, she seems to represent the triumph of the Christian Slavs over the pagan Celts. But remembering the words of the sorceress, we understand the deeper meaning. Within the figure of Mary, the ancient sisters and ancient nation will return. The reincarnating sisters of summer and winter served as an excellent metaphor for this sentiment. Though, keep this play in mind, because while the sisters strongly evoke Ziewonja and Marzanna, they have another aspect which we'll discuss shortly. Likewise, the figure of Lady Poland traveling the country, keeping the spirit of her nation alive through the long occupation, alludes to the keeping of the eternal fire throughout the winter. When Poland regained independence, they resumed the burning of the sacred eternal fire in the tomb of the soldier. This symbolism was absolutely on their minds. The goddess of Poland's warlike attributes and ferocious disposition, mixed with her divine beauty and grace, also mirror the folklore of Dziewanna, far closer than the conventional understandings of Mary. So what we see here isn't really the direct worship of Ziewonja, but the reclaiming of vast swaths of folklore and the Polish reinvention of Mary as the matron of their struggle under occupation. This use of Ziewonja was eventually understood by Russian scholarship, and this is the primary reason why some angry Russian nationalists in internet comments insist that Ziewonja was totally invented by Polish nationalists in the 1800s. The authenticity of Ziewonja within the Western Slavic world is almost universally accepted by historians today. Yes, these figures shaped by Ziewonja did become national symbols of the Polish independence, but that doesn't go back in time and make those older folk stories become nationalist in the first place. While a full understanding of Ziewonja would require an extensive reading of folk tales, we hope this discussion has served as an approachable introduction to her nature, characteristics, context, appearances, and cultural legacy. For our last remarks, we'd like to return attention to the King and Queen of Spring, who shared several holidays with Ziewonja, and to the play named Lelia. In places such as Poland historically, and in Croatia even through today, the Queen of Spring is named Lelia or Lelia, and she's the inspiration for the name of the protagonist of the play, which also features her brothers Leli and Poleli, and those two might sound familiar as two of the gods whose idols stood on Wisagura, along with their mother Wada. Most of the holidays which feature Ziewonja also feature Lelia, and their strongest ties to any location both meet atop Wisagura. Both are young women who represent the return of spring and summer. Both have associations with fire, though these are much stronger with Ziewonja. And both rule over nature, though one is more wild while the other ties herself to general fertility. And both strongly connect to the protection of children. The connections between these two young goddesses has been noticed several times. From the aforementioned play and folktale which readily combine the attributes and stories of both of these goddesses, to historians who firmly feel that the two goddesses were one and the same under different titles. Unfortunately, this topic can't be fully explored here, because we'll need to discuss everything about both the mother Lada and the daughter Lelia, and that would double the length of this video. We're not doing that here. But I'm mentioning this interpretation to confirm that it'll be explored in the upcoming video about the other youthful goddess of summer. That's also where we'll discuss the arguments about whether the goddesses Lada and Lelia were real or not, so please save those comments and questions for that video. But to finish our discussion today, let's return to the winter and Ziewonja's return. As we return to December and enter the heart of winter, the sun has faded, and Perun and Svarog's summery grasp on the world is fully lost. Within the deep snow, we find two folk figures, a hobbling old man named Old Man Star, who is generous and compassionate, but aging and fading, and the beautiful, shining little Lady Star. Within these figures we can find either old Perun or possibly old Svarog losing their grasp on the year, and young fiery Ziewonja taking the fire into her hands, ready to carry it through into the next year. Around early December, in addition to the most famous Little Lady Star, Poland also hosts festivities dedicated to St. Lucy. And on St. Lucy's Day, the festivities begin at the crack of dawn, when a little girl, dressed as the saint with a crown made of candles, goes around and wakes up her family by singing to them. All the people use fire and incense to cleanse their home, and the little girl representing the fiery saint parades around town with a procession of other young girls with their own candles. The celebrations of St. Lucy's Day in Poland strongly evoke the same image of Little Lady Star and of Ziewonja, though this holiday is also very interesting since its customs vary especially widely between countries. In the Czech Republic, St. Lucy is not a single character, but an entire variety of folk spirit, a type of young woman whose face looks like that of a bird, or is otherwise disfigured. And these spirits especially draw focus onto the taboo of sewing within this holiday. We won't be able to discuss the full meaning of St. Lucy's Day until we discuss the additional goddesses, but for now, suffice it to say, it's the final day of the conventional year where we see a Ziewonja overlap with another goddess, leading to the winter solstice where we see Little Lady Star, the burning fiery Ziewonja, guide us out the end of the year and bring us to the next. Our fearless and ferocious light, having guided us always, guides us now to guide us forever.